Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Happy Musicians Podcast, where it's not about getting the gig, it's about enjoying the gig. I'm your host, Tanner Guss, and this week I'm joined by John Raymond. John is a trumpeter, flugelhornist, and composer. He teaches here at the Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. He's played with musicians such as Billy Hart, Orrin Evans, Kurt Rosenwinkel, Gilad Hexelman, and Linda O. He was recently voted a Rising Star Trumpeter in Downbeat Magazine's Critic Poll, and he's just one of my favorite people and a big mentor and inspiration in my life while I was going to school at IU. In our conversation, we talk about defining success, what that looks like, whether it's important, and if it is a healthy way to do it. We talk about finding your musical voice and how it's possible and actually incredibly important to do that while you're a student and while you're learning about the tradition, and how there's a way to both honor the tradition and your voice. We also talk about being in the moment and how his experience as a father has really shaped that for him. And we talk about how it's not about you and how to get out of your ego and be a part of the experience that you're in. Unfortunately, I'm feeling a little bit under the weather while I'm recording these. I think my voice is coming through a little silly and phlegmy, but doing my best to really enjoy this conversation, and I hope you get value out of it. So thanks for being here, and please welcome John Raymond. John Raymond, welcome to the Happy Musicians Podcast.
Thanks, man. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So this is the first interview I'm doing here in Bloomington, hitting the advice from old professors that I had, and I thought we could just jump right into it because we don't have a lot of time before you got to go rehearse your group. And I wanted to talk about your Rising Star Award that you just got. And I think with younger musicians, there's a bit of contention or confusion about that award because it's kind of funny because it's for like young artists, but you're like upon receiving it, you're over 30, you have a full-time career, like faculty gig at a nice university, you've recorded and played with some monster musicians, you tour internationally with your own group, and you've kind of been doing all these things that you're well established in the field, and you're just now receiving this recognition as being like a rising star in the field of jazz. And I think that can be frustrating for younger musicians, but it also seems like maybe move on the part of the community to honor the fact that this is a lifelong thing and you have to put a lot of time into it before you're even really have arrived in any sense, you know? And maybe you could talk about what the award means to you. And it seems kind of funny because nothing big had really changed, and then you got this award. You'd kind of just been grinding away for a while.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny too with those things because you're talking about the Downbeat award, right? Yeah. I mean, it's like there are there are musicians in their 50s who are getting the Rising Star Award. You know, like I think Orrin Evans last year got the Rising Star jazz pianist. He was like the top Rising Star, you know. And Orrin's made like 30 records of his own. So like the whole thing is kind of it's interesting, and it brings up a bigger conversation of like, you know, I think growing up when we all kind of get into jazz music, we look at the people who are doing what we want to do, like they become our heroes, you know, and we see them in Downbeat Magazine or we see them online doing whatever. And I think a lot of times we get this like romanticized version of like what that looks like and how to get that. And it's really not that at all for the most part, you know. There are very few people, I think, who kind of bypass all of those steps along the way that you need to do in order to be at a place where you're even considered for something like that, you know. And so on the one hand, obviously, it's like a great honor, and I'm thrilled about it, and I'm thrilled to be mentioned amongst people that I really respect, because I think, you know, success or quote unquote fame aside, you know, I think something that I strive for to a degree is I want to hold the respect of my peers, you know. I think if you can do that, to me, that matters more than any like Rising Star Award, because everybody knows that you're legit, and you can play this music, But yeah, so I guess in that sense, it's a really cool thing, and in another sense, it's like, well, it's just, I don't know, the jazz media, so to say, is just kind of a funny thing, and it's just kind of a part of the quote unquote game that you have to play with this whole thing,
Yeah. Well, and it's, I think, maybe harmful in some ways, because I know a lot of musicians are waiting for some award or moment to where they can feel like they've made it. Or you'll always hear people saying in school, like practicing, and they're like, oh yeah, like one day I'll be good at the saxophone or whatever, like one day I'll be good. There'll be this moment where I'm happy with my playing, where I feel like I am a real musician or all these things. And I don't know if this award, I would imagine, you didn't feel like, oh, well, now I'm a jazz musician.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's affirming to know that like people know anything of who I am, or know anything that I've done. And in that sense, it's cool. But like, yeah, it doesn't really change the sort of the journey that we all have to take as musicians to be able to do what you are trying to do on your instrument, or to be able to play music the way that you envision playing. And I mean, I'm definitely still not there yet. So like, I'm still reaching for all that, so it doesn't really hold standing with any of that at all,
Yeah, that's funny. Have you noticed that though in some of your students or the musicians that you work with here at the school, and that people maybe don't really consider themselves professionals or musicians, yet they're waiting for, like they wouldn't feel comfortable saying that I'm good at my instrument, I'm ready to do this thing. That's just something I've noticed.
I think it's something we all deal with, and I think especially students deal with it, because you're comparing yourself to your heroes and the people that you're hearing on recordings, and there's a sense where you have to, right? Yeah. In order to get to the level that you want to be as a musician, you have to compare yourself to the best, or at least the people that you call your heroes, and so that's part of the process, and that's part of the imitation process. But I think where we go astray a lot of times as musicians is, I think I heard Mark Juliana say this at some point, that there's like a big difference between expectations and aspirations. And I think a lot of times as musicians we have expectations for ourselves, how we're going to play, how we perform, what our music sounds like. And most of the time those expectations are so high that there's no possible way we can actually meet the expectation. So we're setting ourselves up for failure, Whereas if we aspire to a certain level of music making or something like that, then there's no failure, right? The failure is only if we don't try and we don't aspire to it. But there's not this imaginary bar that you can't meet because that's your expectation, because that's gone at this point, And I think that's a lot of times what, students especially, but I think any professional musician we struggle with is like, it's there's a certain amount of expectation that we place on ourselves, and if we don't meet that, then we can all get pretty unhappy about things,
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And you had talked about, and one of the first things you were saying was that playing the music that you want to play in the way that you want to sound, and imitating masters and the musicians whose voice moves you and compels you to want to play whatever instrument you play that really speaks to your soul, and you're like, that's why I want to do this. I think some people are imitating these masters for forever and maybe never give themselves permission to honor their own voice and try to speak that truthfully.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of freedom that comes with that, in saying that maybe I should be trying to just speak my own voice as truthfully and beautifully as possible, you know?
Sure, yeah.
And do you think that in a college setting, young musicians should be encouraged to pursue that, or do you think they're not necessarily ready to follow their own voice and that you need more foundation based upon the imitation of these master voices first?
Sure. I think every single musician should be encouraged to pursue their own voice in some way. I mean, I think the hard part about being in academia and, I don't know, the hard part for students being in quote-unquote jazz school or music school is there's sort of this like unwritten thing of like, well, you have to have the tradition together. And that's 100% true. But it becomes so much of the focus that I think a lot of times it squeezes out and almost like quenches the creativity that we all have. You know, we all have an imagination. We all are creative in some way, shape, or form. It's going to look different from person to person how that plays out, but we all have that in us. And part of music and part of art in general is like tapping into that in some way. And so I think if students in particular aren't encouraged and given the space to actually do that, then you're actually removing like the most important part of what you're trying to do, you know. You still, I mean, as a professor, I still need to work with students and teach students like how to play in such a way where you're honoring the past.
Yeah.
And what you do is informed by it. Mm-hmm. And it's that way for a reason, because I think, you know, history has shown that if you're really deeply rooted in things that came before you, you just have what you're going to say yourself just has more validity and it has more depth. Nothing exists in a bubble, so you don't just like make music without being influenced by anything. And I think especially if we're trying to call ourselves jazz musicians in some way, shape, or form, then we have to kind of do our homework, you know. But even if we're trying to be funk musicians or we're trying to be gospel musicians or whatever it might be, we still have to do our homework in that sense too, you know. But I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Like, I don't think studying the past and being creative and doing your own thing are mutually exclusive. They can exist together. And I think the goal to me as a teacher is like, how can I foster an environment that does both?
Yeah.
You know, because they have to exist together.
Right. And do you have any practices that you do or exercises that you think educators can use to help a student find their voice and apply it in context to what they've learned historically and traditionally? Like, are there certain exercises that people can do to experience and explore their own voice?
Yeah. Well, I mean, with a lot of my students now, I'm trying to encourage a certain amount of improvisation and personal liberty with almost everything that we're doing. From like the way that we play long tones to the way that we work on scales. You know, like, yeah, there's a validity to doing very specific scale patterns or exercises as a trumpet player or a wind instrument player. Obviously, that gets your technique together and it gets you really familiar with that sound, and it just like gets you comfortable. Gets you comfortable with things on all registers of your instrument. But what's to say that you have to play one specific pattern and that's the only way to do it? You know, like, why don't we combine 3 different sort of scale pattern exercises and do that? Or what if you just make up patterns yourself, like according to what you're hearing, you know? and then even as we get into like learning tunes and working on improvisation or style, like being able to imitate things, but then being able to take that and use that as a grounds to do your own thing, you know? So taking an element of somebody's solo that you've transcribed that you find really interesting and doing something with it. So like, let's say you're transcribing Clifford Brown and you notice like, man, he just is using all these enclosures all over the place in his soloing to get from one chord to a next. All these like chromatic, you know, things in between lines. Okay, so can I just make a solo entirely out of enclosures? Or how can I explore the enclosures thing on a bigger level without necessarily saying like I have to do it like Clifford Brown? Yeah, there's merit to that. You learn a certain amount in that, but you also learn equally as much when you just take a concept and you just kind of run with it and see where it goes, you know. So I feel like I'm encouraging students these days to just do it in every sense of their practicing, you know, every aspect of their practicing. And that way there's this constant thread and theme of you're always being creative. You're always improvising to some degree. You're always tapping into that part of yourself as an artist that is not just regurgitating, but you're actually creating, and like maybe that'll lead to something that you don't even know what it'll lead to, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Those are a couple of things. It's pretty simple, you know, but I think that's the stuff that we do and we practice all day, every day, especially when we're getting all of our stuff together. And so why not just make it fun,
right?
Make it creative, you know?
Yeah, well, and it seems like you have a focus on finding, rather than just learning a whole solo, if it's maybe not all compelling to you, but finding the part from that traditional, like historic source, finding that part and then using it in a creative way and contextualizing it for yourself. That's really cool.
And I mean, ultimately, if you want my big existential opinion, I mean...
Which I do.
Okay, well, great. So I'm going to give it to you. You know, to me, the role that I play as a teacher is just to be a guide. You know, it's to find where that spark happens for every student and find ways to feed that spark so that everything becomes incredibly exciting for them. Yeah. When you get to that point as a student, you just need somebody to keep pushing you to do that. Once you find that thing that you get excited about and that really like makes you burn, you know, that's the thing that I think for every student, and even for every teacher, that's what you're trying to get every student to find. And if you can do that, then as a teacher, like I said, you're just kind of like stoking the flame and just trying to keep that going, but hopefully not trying to exert too much opinion because, you know, it's their journey and it's their process. And in that sense, I feel like, you know, you get to a certain point as a teacher and you can be kind of hands off in such a way where you're not getting too involved with a student. You still care deeply, right? And you're still like invested in them in every sense, but you're not dictating what they do and how they play. You're just directing them, sort of steering them, you know? And then I think you get to a point as a student where you learn how to do that yourself. And that's where, you know, hopefully by that time coincides with people kind of getting out of school. And so then they can get into the real world and sort of figure things out for themselves and always know how to keep that fire there. And there's always going to be points where you go back to that teacher, you go back to other teachers, and you try to get inspiration and you need help and you need guidance. But I think you kind of get to this point where you figure something out and you can just go.
Yeah.
You're kind of pushed out of the nest or something, you know. I don't know. who knows?
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. And do you think a lot of your career has been groups that you've put together yourself and that you compose original stuff for? And do you think composition is an important part of finding your musical voice?
Totally. Yeah. I think in some way, shape, or form, however formal you want it to look, I don't think it needs to look the same way for anyone, really. But composing, I think in its most raw form, is just creating something. And that can be writing a quote-unquote a tune, or it can be, like writing something in Logic or in Ableton that's totally you. And not thinking about it from a more, like I said, formal, institutionalized sense of composition, but just like, whatever, just make music,
Yeah.
Make something.
Yeah, for sure. No, I love all that. And one thing that we had talked about, this is kind of changing path, but we had talked in the past about finding the moment or the zone or like a flow state, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And you had said something funny that really stuck with me. You were like, well, after I had a kid, it just made sense. And maybe you could talk about that, how that experience honed in what it meant to you to be like present in the moment.
Well, I mean, for starters, I will say that I remember very vividly the first gig that I had after we had our first child. And she's almost 5 now, so it was almost that long ago. And I remember going to the gig and having this incredibly strong sense and feeling that I was just like totally free to make music. It felt so much more free than it ever had. And I think part of that was because at some point in the week prior, when I had become a dad, I realized that, like, wow, I just got so much perspective on life, what's really important and where my priorities are. And it kind of made me realize that obviously music is incredibly powerful and I love it more than many things in the world, but it's just music. It's just music.
Yeah.
And it sort of took this pressure off for me of why I don't know why I was putting pressure on it, but it removed that pressure and allowed me to just like enjoy it. And that was a really powerful experience. And I think, even in the 5 years it's been since we had our first daughter, the process of being a father in and of itself requires you to be incredibly in the moment, because you can't come home and be all frustrated about how you were playing that day and about how this gig went and that, like, it's not about you anymore.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a really great lesson in kind of realizing that music that we make shouldn't just be this selfish endeavor.
Yeah.
That or maybe not selfish, but like the whole world doesn't revolve around us.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times when we get in these weird headspaces, when we play, we're in some way, shape, or form thinking that the whole world is like revolving around how we play our instrument.
Yes, 100%.
And that's an incredibly destructive thing, if nothing else, because it's just not true, right?
Yeah.
It's like this lie that we somehow convince ourselves is reality that is just a total farce.
Yeah. Well, it makes it so stressful, because if the whole world revolves around your solo, those are such high stakes.
Right. Right. And so I think, in general, the more I grow as a musician and the older I get, the more I realize how small I am and how small even this moment in time is in terms of like this life and eternity and wherever you want to go with that. Like it takes all the pressure off in that sense, and it's just like, okay, well, I'm just gonna enjoy this moment for whatever it is.
Yeah.
And just be a part of it. And it's not to say that it's not work, and it's not to say that music making you don't have to focus, because it's the exact opposite. You want to try to focus, but you're focusing in whatever that moment is.
Yeah.
And I think the fatherhood has really taught me that, and I'm still learning a lot from it. And it continually makes me a better musician.
That's cool.
Overall.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think the moral of that is that we should all just have children and it'll make us better musicians. But
Agreed.
It sounds like for you, that was a very concrete experience that has maybe helped you remove yourself from this ego, I-centered thought process and more of an outside of yourself way of viewing things.
Mm-hmm.
And on a more applicable level for most people, it could be even just the fact that on the bandstand, if you're most interested in yourself in that moment, you're going to feel really closed off and unpresent in the moment. And these are things that like meditation and mindfulness and these things try to train your mind to do. But if you can be more interested and care more about the music, the song, the other musicians, and what they sound like, maybe that's what you could apply from that lesson.
Yeah. The way I think about it a lot of times is like, imagine like you're driving, right? And when you drive, you're aware of a lot of things. But most things are in your peripherals, right? The only thing that you're really focusing on is what's in front of you. Like you're moving forward, you focus on the road. To some extent, you're not like narrowly staring down the road, but you're aware of all these other things. And a lot of those are in your peripherals. They might be like things that you don't see, that you have to glance in your rearview mirror before, or your side mirrors. They could be like cars next to you, or people crossing on a crosswalk, or whatever. And these things are all peripheral, and you're noticing them, and you're aware of them, but you're not solely focused on any of them. Mm-hmm. And I think music making is very similar, where the mindset that we want to have is like we're driving. Like we ourselves should be in the peripheral, right? As well as every other instrument. Somewhere, I kind of like visualize things like I'm looking at a dashboard, right? And like
you've spent too much time on the road.
Maybe, yeah, maybe that's. I can like see almost like the drums here and the bass here and the other horn here and the piano or guitar here, and everything else is like it's in view, right? But you're never overly focused on one thing, because if you are, you're going to miss everything else.
Yeah.
And so there's this sense, I think, that when we make music, we want to be focused on the big picture, like the holistic thing that's happening, which we call, quote unquote, the music, right? So the music is the main goal. The sound is the main goal. And everything else is kind of in there, and you're aware of it, what's going on, but it never becomes solely the focus, Mm-hmm. And I think that can be a really helpful thing, because a lot of times, like you said, we put ourselves in particular as the sole thing that we're focusing on, and we have no chance to be able to fit in with the music around us,
Yeah. And it can be tough, because if you're in a place where like Bloomington, for instance, there's great facilities and faculty, and you learn a lot about music, but there's not a ton of work to be had, especially as a horn player. If you don't have your own project or something and you're really entrepreneurial about finding work, you outside of like jam sessions, you might only have a small handful of public performances in a semester. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times professors will talk about how you just need time on the bandstand.
Yep.
And from what I've experienced, I think now being in a place where I'm playing several times a week, and it's not like I only have these few moments to express myself musically. If anything, it's obviously helped me become a better musician, but I'm also less attached to each performance. Exactly. I want to do a good job, but I realize that I'll be back here next week.
Exactly.
You know? Yep. And it can be tough in music school when you don't have playing opportunities, because these small moments become so important and you over dramatize them. Mm-hmm. It can become crippling for some people.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, the thing that I have been telling a lot of students here is obviously you got to pursue any opportunity to play out that you can, first and foremost. But you also need to be playing with each other, you know? Like, part of that bandstand experience is learning how to listen, mm-hmm. right? And it's like learning how to interact and learning how to, like, what your role is in any context, and just play that role and do it really well. And you can get a taste of that when you just play with other people. I think it's when we get so isolated and locked into, I have to practice my own thing by myself for 8 hours a day, you know. Yes, that's good because you got to work on your own thing. But if you aren't leaving any time to just simply make music and create things with other people, you're never going to give yourself a chance when you do get to the bandstand to know how to succeed. Mm-hmm. You know, that's like a really important bridge that if that's not happening, I think a lot of times students miss out on what they could get out of the whole thing, you know?
Yeah. And I guess maybe people hold on to that feeling of the importance of this one solo or whatever because they think that you need to be really serious and committed about the performance. But I guess I feel like as I'm becoming more comfortable with letting that thought go and that attachment, it's actually freeing, and I am able to just better serve the moment, and it hasn't detracted from it at all. It's just made it better and less harmful. But it could be easy to see how you're holding on to that because you think that that's what it means to be digging in, mm-hmm. or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And it goes back to what we already talked about in terms of, like, why are we doing what we do? You know, like, is it for ourselves? Mm-hmm. There's a certain amount of personal gratification that we all get from playing music. It's undoubtedly true. But ultimately, it can't be about us. And it has to be about something bigger, because we just get stuck in this vortex of ego and self and all that stuff, and it just, like, kills all of the creativity. You know, there's no possible way for as skilled or technically gifted a musician you might be, there's no possible way to really make beautiful music if you are at the center. Like, there's no way, mm-hmm. you know. You have to figure out some way to get out of that cycle.
Yeah. You know? And for you, like, what is the higher, and maybe it's something we've already talked about, but this higher reason for doing this, or like a higher purpose? Is it concrete for you, or?
It is, in a sense, in that for me, my faith is the most important thing to me. And so I ultimately believe that what part of my purpose on this earth is to be an artist and to be a musician. And it becomes a calling, you know, less of a personal ambition, mm-hmm. as it is. I'm made to do this. So so in order to like fulfill that calling that I feel like I have to do what I need to do, as an artist. And I think ultimately for me, I just think music is, ultimately, I think music is meant to glorify God because He's the maker of music and He's the maker of me and everything in this world. And so ultimately, my calling and my purpose is to glorify God through what I do. Now, that can look so many different ways. It doesn't have to look like I overtly you make quote unquote Christian jazz music. Like, what is that really? Yeah. But it does mean on a certain level, if nothing else, that like the motivations of my heart and the things that I want to be aligned with what I believe to be true and most spiritually accurate,
Yeah.
And so that's all I can control, really. I can't control anybody's experience of how I play or what happens out of my horn or the music that I make. But I can control myself, and I can control what I want and what I'm going for,
Yeah. Well, it's cool because you don't have to put a label on it or make some announcement beforehand that I'm playing for God for this performance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or that this is...
Do a Tebow,
Christmas,
Yeah.
But yeah, I think just the fact that you have a personal feeling and an idea in your own mind of why you're doing this, people can pick up on that. Just the fact alone that they can feel that this seems like it's coming from a different
Something
place.
else.
It's coming from something else. And yeah, you don't have to define it, but people can be moved by just the fact that they know that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. One thing that you had said before that you said is kind of a whole different thing, but was about defining success. And I've been kind of thinking about that a lot lately, and I'm still undecided about if it's important to try to define success so that you can have some sense of accomplishment at some point, or and having some kind of realistic thing, because I think usually it's like these things that are so impossible to achieve or have a lot of luck involved, and you might never get to, but you could still be an amazing performer and not have these things, and if having a more realistic version of success is important, or if just having any kind of definition for what success is
Sure.
already detrimental.
Well, I think on one level, how would I describe it? On one level, when you talk about success, there's this idea of, okay, it's either like you achieve something, right? That's what most people think of success as. And while the achievement is great, I think the old adage that it's more about the journey than the destination comes up. And I think the danger with having success be solely lying in what you achieve or things that you achieve is what happens when you achieve them. You just like, okay, I'm done. We're good. You hear like athletes who work their whole lives to try to win a Super Bowl or try to win a World Series or like an NBA Finals, or something. And they talk about like, okay, well, wow, this was like my lifelong dream. And then inevitably a reporter asks like, well, what's next? They say, well, we just got to do it again, and you keep doing this. And there's a certain, weight to being able to like win 3 NBA Finals in a row, or win multiple championships or something if you're an athlete. But even that, like ultimately your career is going to end at some point, and then what?
Yeah.
Do you have any purpose? Like what's your goal? And I think that the hard part about success is if it lies in achievement, as I was saying, you run the risk of getting to a point where there's nothing else to achieve.
Yeah.
Or on the flip side, always being frustrated that you're not achieving what you want to, right? And so to me, a big part of how I think we should define success is more about the journey. And I think specifically the thing that I've thought a lot about over the years is that I don't want to make my version of success about things that I do, but I want it to be about who I am. So if I'm more focused on every day, day in and day out, how can I not only work the hardest that I can and most sincerely and most focused at what I am doing musically, but can I also be the person that I want to be and that I know I need to be, then to me that's success. It's not I'm going to achieve this thing or I'm going to do these things, because then it's that expectation aspiration thing again. It's like it kind of sets me up for failure in any way you go about it, if you achieve those things or if you don't. And I think if it's more focused on like inward motivations and inward growth and doing all that you can do in whatever sense that looks, then you always have a chance to be successful at what you do. And it becomes less about, being recognized or getting some accolade or achieving something or doing this or doing that, which inherently I think a lot of that stuff is like we want these things because it strokes our ego and it makes us feel good about ourselves when we're praised and when we're affirmed at what we do. Whereas I think if we find success in sort of a personal self-affirmation, and an affirmation of the journey that we're on as musicians, that's much more healthy to me.
Right. Well, it makes a lot of sense because that success is, am I constantly in a place where I'm living and making music from a place that's based on my morals and how I want to live my life?
Mm-hmm.
Am I adhering to the person and player I want to be on just a daily basis? And then you can say, well, I'm practicing in this way that I don't like. I'm not being successful today.
Right. Exactly. And there are all days that we don't live up to that. For every one of us. But like I said, I think if the focus is more inward and the focus is more on who we are and who we become and how we do things, the rest takes care of itself, And I think then if you do experience any great achievement or any accolade, or you get to do some great gigs, or you live out your dreams, whatever that might mean or however that might look, then it's just the chips falling, You have to. I feel like, to me, the most healthy version of success is when you let all the chips fall, and you strive for things and you can go for things, and have goals that are concrete even, but like you ultimately have to let go of the result and just focus on the process. And that's the way I think that we can be the most happy, is letting go of that. Because it goes back to that same thing that we were talking about. Like, if if success is defined by what I achieve and I don't achieve it, then I've failed. And then what? Like then you're left in this like state where you're down and you're dark and you're depressed, or you're in whatever place that we don't want to be, you know. But if your goal is, I want to be the best person that I can be, I want to work as hard as I can doing what I do, and I'm just going to let the results take care of themselves, I can live with that, you know. That's cool, you know.
Yeah, I love it. All right, that's going to bring us to our coda question round, which is 5 short answer questions that we do on every episode. Before we take the coda and get out of here.
Nice.
And the first one is, what is your go-to feel-good album?
Oof, go-to feel-good album. Donny Hathaway. I can't remember what the record is, but it's a Donny Hathaway record. I mean, anything Donny Hathaway, for that matter. That's a go-to feel-good.
Yeah. What's the best advice about happiness that you've received?
See, this is hard.
Normally I send these ahead of time, but I forgot to.
Okay. Let's see. The best advice I've received about happiness. That we all deserve to be happy.
Yeah.
Like, if you're not happy, then you should do something about that.
I like it. Yeah.
You know?
For sure. Who's a musician in your life who's living a particularly healthy, happy, and fulfilling life?
Well, somebody that I think of is a guy that I went to school with in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And we've recently started working together on a new project of some kind. And his name is Sean Carey, and he is a drummer and pianist and vocalist, songwriter, singer-songwriter. He's got his own band or own project called S. Carey, and he also plays in Bon Iver. And I think of Sean. Sean, I respect him a lot and look up to him a lot in terms of what he's doing and how he's doing it, you know.
Cool. Yeah. What one bit of advice would you give to young musicians who are just kind of starting their careers, getting things going?
To find the thing that you get obsessed over and run as hard as you can after that.
I love it. And then you already said it, but just to reiterate, what is your purpose as a musician?
Oof. Well, maybe I'll elaborate on what I said before, because then it'll be a little different. I think ultimately, you know, when we make music, we share this moment with somebody or with an audience. We share like a certain time and space and location and feeling, and the only thing that you can do, or the best thing that you can do, that I want to do, is one, be totally submissive to that moment and just try to be a conduit for whatever I feel like needs to happen in that moment, musically and emotionally and spiritually. And even more than that, just to be genuine and to be honest and to be human, you know. I think that's ultimately the thing that we share with people when we play music, is we share this like this sense of humanity. And I want that to happen, and I want that to happen as powerfully and as transcendent as it can. You know?
Yeah. No, I love it. Well, before we're done, if you want, you can put them in the plug zone now and let them know about anything you want to bring their attention to coming up, places you can send them online, or projects that you have in the works that you want people to know about.
Nice. Well, I've got a band called Real Feels, and it's a trio that I've had for 5 or 6 years now, and I feel very fortunate to play with those guys. And you could find any of our music on Spotify or YouTube or on my website, which is john-raymond or john-raymond.com. Recently changed, so I have to make note of that. And then, as I think I mentioned, I'm working on a project right now with Sean S. Carey, the singer-songwriter friend of mine, that we are working on and will hopefully come out sometime in 2020. That is something that I am more happy about than any other music that I've ever made in my life. So I can't really tell you much more than that, other than it's music that I feel really strongly and deeply about, and I'm really excited about it. So.
Cool. Well, I'm excited to hear it. Thanks so much for doing this and taking the time to share your thoughts. Appreciate it, John.
Totally, man.
All right, that does it for this week's episode of the Happy Musicians Podcast. The featured track this week is Where We Grew Up, the most recent single from John's group Real Feels, which features drummer Colin Stranahan and guitarist Gilad Hexelman. Hope you got value out of this episode. I know I did. And if you did, maybe you can share it with your friends. Post about it on social media. You can find more information about everything we talk about on our website, thehappymusicians.com. You can find us anywhere at The Happy Musicians. Subscribe to the show. Give us a rating if you can. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you for your time and your attention. And stay happy.